I'm glad you stayed on News Desk. Let's talk our prisons now. And the Ghana Prison Service has rejected aspects of the latest United Nations report describing conditions in the country's prisons as below acceptable standards, explaining that the UN requirement of prisons cannot be easily met in a third world country like Ghana. Public Relations Officer of the Ghana Prisons, Vitalis IE, however, noted efforts are currently underway to holistically address challenges, including those highlighted by the report. And we'll discuss this over the next few minutes. I have with me in the studio Dennis Armah. He is president of the Human Rights Advocate at African Heights Foundation. I believe I got that right.
Yes.
Right. So Dennis, listen, I mean, if you take what I have just read, we can't meet the UN standards because we're a third world country. What interpretation do you make of it?
Well, the international standards are not standards of the first world countries. They are standards of the international community as a whole. And various countries, including Ghana, accept these standards. These are not standards which are imposed. And in fact, even in some first world countries, you also realize that standards can be poor and quite brutish. So it is more about the will to have the best standards in your prisons. And the best standards are not to turn prisons into luxury homes, but just to make sure that they are places fit for human habitation. And the truth is that if you visit our prisons, conditions are quite poor. And it seems that we have not gone beyond that mindset of the prisons having the only role of extreme punishment and destruction of the person. And that is not acceptable in our current situation as a democratic country. And also it is not sensible economically, because apart from a few limited offenses, most prisoners would be released back into society. So if they actually emerge from the prisons worse than they went in, that in the end does not benefit society as a whole. We actually suffer more for that. And there's nothing you can do about the limits of punishment, custodial sentences for offenses. So it is best that you ensure that in the prisons, people can have conditions which will promote their development as human beings, so that they don't come back more dangerous to society, or they don't come back completely destroyed and useless to their families and dependent for the rest of their lives. And our prisons do have some very harsh conditions that I have witnessed myself. And it is necessary that the recommendations that were made by the UN in this report are taken seriously.
Let's look at our prisons and the fact that let us draw the line. Having the resource and actually meeting those recommendations or the UN chapter. How do you handle that? We live in a country where indeed we do not have the resource. How do we meet those?
Some of these standards are actually meant to cater for the limited resources. So for example, if you have limited resources, you are supposed to take remand prisoners, the issue of remand prisoners, very serious. And if you go to our main security prison at Nsawam, you find out that quite a huge percentage of the population are remand prisoners who are not supposed to be there, or who are supposed to be facing trial and transferred to another position. And the UN report, for example, suggests that custody of remand prisoners should be moved away from the police service to the prison service, because while the prison service holds them, they are still under the responsibility of the police service. So the prison officers can do nothing about their stay in the prisons. And if you ask them, they are quite futile about it. They think there is nothing that they can do unless the police officer who is in charge of investigation comes for that remand prisoner and takes him for trial.
But is there something they can do?
Yes, it's just a matter of transferring responsibility legally to the prison service, so that the prison officers who hold them there would have to ensure that they don't stay there for as longer than their warrants actually expects them to stay. So for example, if there are cases where police officers who are in charge of the investigation are transferred and nobody takes care of the docket of the prisoner, so the prisoner remains there, and when you go there, they rush to the bars trying to give you messages you can't deliver, because many of them may be abandoned, some may be foreigners, some their families may not even be aware that they are in prison custody. And so just transferring responsibility from the police service to the prison service does not cost any money. You understand? And indeed, having the remand prisoners processed expeditiously would save us money.
What would it take to do that legal transfer?
It's just an act of parliament which can do that. Or you could even have it in regulations which can do that. And other issues like the imposition of custodial sentences for most offenses is quite outmoded today. In many communities, you need some form of labor. Communal labor is not at the level that it used to be. You have people in responsibility in those communities. You have government structures in every district. They can be made to do some communal work rather than being kept in the prisons and fed and degraded in those conditions when they can be useful to society. And indeed, there are some offenses. The report specifically suggests that for women, for example, it is better to give them such responsibilities than to take them, because they are often not a violent threat to the rest of society to the extent that they must be kept away in some detention somewhere.
Hence, it is better to give them non-custodial sentences.
Exactly.
But do we have the system for non-custodial sentences?
I think we do. We just need to legalize it and have a legal framework for it so that we see who is in charge of supervision. It could be a magistrate, it could be local government officials, it could even be opinion leaders in society and leaders in society. Like if you ask someone to do some work in the school, the headmaster can take care of that. And it's in his interest that the work is done. So it's quite easy to have such things done. And the other suggestions, such as having open farm camps instead of the seclusion of the prisons for those who are less dangerous, to be working on those farms, which would also be secured.
I think they have a system like that already. It's not widespread.
Yes.
But they do have a system
They
like
usually
that.
take them out for some labor and return them to the prisons. But if the prisons are congested already and all they do is to go and work outside and return to the prisons, that is not the most ideal conditions. You could actually have large farms which would have facilities for their residents so that they stay in the farms as well.
I see. Let's look at some of the human rights that are being abused in our prisons. Share that with us.
One of the major issues that the report highlights is the delegation of disciplinary responsibilities to other prison inmates, which the report characterizes as being corrupt and abusive, because the idea is that these people are there for criminal offenses, and then you put them over their peers in the prisons, and often it leads to a lot of abuse and a lot of torture in the prisons.
Is it wrong to do that?
Yes, it's wrong. The prison officers, yes, the prison officers are supposed to take responsibility for discipline in the prisons. And the Prisons Act, which was actually passed under a military regime under the NRC, actually provides in section 25 that prison officers are prohibited from maltreating or oppressing prisoners. And so if you delegate it, sometimes you don't know if that is the idea, that if they feel if they delegate it to someone else to do it, then they cannot be held responsible for it. But legally, they are still responsible.
Let's figure this out again. Let's try and get a better understanding. When a prison officer chooses a leader to say oversee an aggregate of some of these prisoners, is wrong.
Yes, especially when they have disciplinary responsibility, which often means that they inflict corporal punishment on their colleagues in the prisons. You could supervise, they could have supervisory responsibilities, but if there is a need for disciplinary action, it has to be done by the prison officers themselves.
For some of the prisoners to be given supervisory roles as long as they are within the prisons. It's not wrong. But it's wrong when they have disciplinary duties as well.
Exactly, which often involve corporal punishment. Because if you've noted, even in the schools where teachers are trained, in training colleges, and they are not people with criminal records, there are very severe restrictions on the use of corporal punishment, even in schools. But somehow in the prisons, it's as if it's free for all. And people who have a criminal record are given responsibility to inflict, often violent criminal record, to inflict such corporal punishment on their colleagues, which may result in very serious injuries when you don't have good hospital care facilities in the prisons. You are only escalating your cost of maintaining the prisoners instead of having the prison officers who have been trained to have that responsibility of discipline in the prisons.
Which other rights are being violated besides the torture? Which other rights are being violated?
Torture affects the right to dignity, and also you have the poor sanitary conditions, which ends up affecting their health and also their nutrition in the prisons, which is something which is highlighted. If you see the conditions under which they are fed, the meals they are given, it's definitely an affront to their development and to their dignity also. So because a lot of the rights of prisoners are already restricted by law, most of the rights that we may take for granted, they don't have those rights. So when it comes to inflicting pain and violence on them, that is a very serious matter, because already in the environment of a prison, people are psychologically vulnerable. There are other suggestions they make, which coincidentally have been made by our Constitutional Review Commission as well, that we should have an independent legal aid commission which would be in charge of representing prisoners who are unable to afford lawyers, because you'd realize that is a serious problem that we have. And also legally also, our evidence decree states that
the legal aid should be different from the Justice for All system.
The Justice for All system is perhaps a model that can be developed, but there is a legal aid system which represents people right from the start. They don't need to be in prisons before, so that they don't even get to prison and escalate the cost of maintaining prisoners. So you can have a legal aid system, but right now it is still under the government's control, and that means people may not trust the system. You can set up an independent commission which is in charge of that, so that prisoners would be made, it would promote its functions, prisoners would be more trusting of the legal aid system and utilize it, so that those who do not deserve to go to prison do not end up there. I was also referring to the use of evidence which is obtained under torture, which happens both in police cells and also in the prisons. And our Evidence Act states that all relevant evidence is admissible, which means that the police can extract evidence under such conditions. And the experience in the legal system is that often such evidence is not credible, because if you are torturing someone to admit to a crime, most likely they will admit to the crime, and that may not be the truth. And also it ends up torturing prisoners would also have the effect of, if the evidence they obtain is legal, then the police in investigations are encouraged indirectly to torture prisoners and obtain that evidence in order to bring closure to the cases that they have in their dockets.
What can we do about that?
It also requires, and the report specifically mentions, an amendment of a law. This is again a law which was passed from a military regime, and under such a system, most countries, including the UK, where we borrowed most of these laws from, have gone ahead to prohibit the use of torture. And Article 15 of the Convention Against Torture specifically imposes the responsibility on states to prohibit the use of evidence obtained under torture in court proceedings.
Does the country have an excuse to say, well, I do not have the resources, so it becomes okay for us to abuse our prisoners or convicts in our prisons because we don't have the resource?
Our constitution addresses issues like that, even though it's not done specifically in the context of prisons. In education, for example, what is expected is a progressive realization, and that concept is known to the international human rights system too. What is expected is that you have a progressive realization of the rights, especially socioeconomic rights, which may require some resources, so that you need to have a plan that we are going to be investing this amount in our prisons every year, or in our budget's allocation for improvement of services. But you cannot say that because you don't have sufficient resources, some section of the population completely should be deprived of their humanity because there are no resources. I think
that's what we forget, that there is a section of the population, and like you said, they come back into the society. They are not in prison forever. Well, some of them are, but most of them come back to the society.
Yes, and indeed, there have been people who have come back to save their societies. Our own Kwame Nkrumah is an example. Nelson Mandela is an example. If those people had been brutalized extremely in prison and completely destabilized psychologically, the world would have lost the benefit of their humanity. And indeed, they have come out to do wonderful things. And it's not just limited to these people. There are lots of people who have come out of prisons to do wonderful things for society. So it is best that society still regards them as human beings. And the little that can be done just to make them feel human enough should be done, without the limitation of resources being used as an excuse to completely derive them. The resources are not zero. It's not at zero. So if it's at 1, they should get 1/10. If it's at 2, they should get 2/10. But you can't allocate 0 to them and say you have limited resources.
That's where we live now, where the country is telling us that, well, we don't have the resource, so we can't provide adequately if we are able to at all for that section of the population. What can we do about it? Besides, we know that yes, it's wrong, but then well, what?
The effort of the international community and civil society and the media also is to bring pressure to bear on government to stop using the limitation of resources as an excuse for doing nothing at all, because the limitation of resources is not the absence of resources. If it's limited, yes, we want to see limited support for these people. We don't want to see fabulous support for them. All we want to see is the limited support which reflects the resources that we have. And indeed, you find out that there are some allocations which are in this country which are quite on the high side and on the luxurious side, but for some people you are told you can get nothing at all. They are also citizens, and the Supreme Court has ruled that they can actually vote. And it is because of some of these deprivation of their rights which resulted from them not having any say at all in society that motivated the general movement towards giving prisoners some limited rights in society as well.
Perhaps we should start looking at what the prison service uses the money it's given for, because I recall that in an interview with the service, I was told that indeed last year had been good because they got some money from government. It was better than years before. And so for us to go back to them and then they tell us that we don't have the resource, and so we can't provide for that population. How can we ensure that indeed, whatever it is, like you said, the limited support they get from the government is used judiciously?
We have a Controller and Accountants General which monitors the use of resources which are allocated to public agencies. But I think the civil society